We're joined now by Mike Schmidt, New York Times Washington reporter who broke this news. Mike, take us through what you're reporting.
We're basically reporting about the next movement in this investigation, the fact that Jack Smith wants to have, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump testify before a grand jury. I was thinking back on the different investigations into Trump. I think this is the first time that I can recall that either of them have been asked to testify before a grand jury. It's obviously a different environment than simply sitting down and being interviewed by prosecutors or agents the way that Kushner was during the Mueller investigation. And the biggest question, I think, here is what will Trump do? As you were pointing out, yes, Trump did allow them, or I don't know, that's probably not the right way of saying it. Trump didn't try and stop them from speaking before the January 6th committee. What will he do here? We know that he has become very obsessive about these investigations in recent months. He's obviously in a different place today than he was when the congressional investigation was going on. His legal criminal liability is even more to the forefront as all of these different sprawling investigations unspool locally and at the federal level. So what will he do? Will he try and stop them from testifying? It seemed like they willingly went in to meet with the January 6th committee. The January 6th committee was able to use their testimony very effectively. I think, they kept on playing that clip of Ivanka Trump talking about how she did not think that there was election fraud, sort of endorsing the view of Bill Barr. They were constantly playing these clips, and Jack Smith showing, look, whether it's Mike Pence or the president's son-in-law and daughter, he's not afraid to reach as far into Trump's inner circle as possible.
Mike, there's some reporting in the story that I want to see if you can sort of tell us if you have any indication that these are of specific interest to Jack Smith. You write that Ms. Trump was in the Oval Office on January 6th as her father placed a late morning call to Pence to pressure him to block or delay congressional certification of the Electoral College results documenting Joe Biden's victory. As president of the Senate, Pence, who rejected Trump's demands, was to serve in a ceremonial role. Is there anything to be read into the importance of, I know one of the chronicled challenges of other investigations into Trump was that lack of firsthand witnesses to the criminal act. Is Ivanka a potential window into what Trump actually said and did and why he said it?
Of course she is. Look, Jack Smith wants to talk to everyone who was interacting with Trump in this period of time to understand what were the true motivations behind what he was doing. That's why he wants to talk to Mike Pence, and that's why he wants to talk to Jared and Ivanka. I think we have a pretty good sense from them, from the transcripts of their interview before the January 6th committee, about what they would say. And remember, they can't really deviate from what they said to Congress because that would raise questions about the accuracy of that testimony. So, look, if you're Jack Smith, you want to know everything Trump was saying, whether it helps build a case or doesn't, because no matter what happens, you need to know what he was saying and doing, because if he was saying things that would potentially undermine a criminal charge, that's really important information for a prosecutor to have, because that information would have to be disclosed at a trial. So you want a 360-degree view of what Trump was doing and saying, not just the things that help get you to the charge, but the things that also may cut against it, because at the end of the day, that will all come out if you were to indict and go to trial.
Mike, there's an interesting sort of final note here. You write this, quote, it's a Trump, what do we call them? Truth. It's so ironic I can barely say that. But this is something Trump distributed on his platform, Truth Social. Quote, contrary to fake news reporting, I never asked Jared or Ivanka to be part of the 2024 campaign for president, and in fact, specifically asked them not to do it, Trump wrote, going on to say the campaign would be, quote, too mean and nasty. Is that to be read by anyone as cutting them loose? I think he tweeted that after they were known to have testified before the Select Committee.
I don't know what he means by what he's saying. I can't make sense of that. It's clear that they don't have it, at least based on sort of what we know. They're not in the room with Trump every day the way they were in the White House. Besides that, what does the inner workings of the Trump family look like post-White House? I don't have a great sense of it. I'm not sure if Trump was, I'm not sure what that message or tweet or whatever posting was about or what he was trying to say. At the end of the day, these were people who were around Trump for some of the most critical moments of his presidency. And to have access to those people, it would be a pretty extraordinary thing. It was extraordinary when the January 6th committee spoke to them, and it will be extraordinary if they ultimately, are able to get their testimony before a grand jury, because these are not just run-of-the-mill aides. These aren't just people who were there at different points. They were there for the entire presidency and in the room for much of it. And that's just an incredible wealth of information. If you're a prosecutor looking at Donald Trump in a wide, range of things, these are great witnesses.
Andrew Weissman, there's another line in this story I want to read to you because I forgot about this fact. Mike's reporting this, quote, Ms. Trump accompanied her father to the rally of his supporters on the Ellipse near the White House. Hundreds of Trump supporters moved from there to the Capitol, where they attacked the building, some chanting, quote, hang Mike Pence for his refusal to do what Trump wished. I forgot she made that movement with him, but Cassidy Hutchinson certainly brought our attention to how pivotal those hours were, both his knowledge that they were armed, his desire and intent to have the mags removed so his armed supporters could get closer to the stage, and all of his angsting and agitating to travel to the Capitol with his armed supporters takes place in that window of time. What's the significance of Ivanka as a witness?
So there's also that there's discrepancy that we learned a little bit about from the January 6th committee between, I think, Sarah Matthews and Ivanka with respect to the president's state of mind at the Ellipse and whether he was particularly upset or fraught at the time. And so this is somebody who was there on January 6th with the former president. So learning about all of his reactions, what he was seeking to do, what his demeanor was, whether he wanted to go to the Capitol. As Mike said, this is somebody who, yes, she is the president's daughter, but she also, because of that, was given this position at the White House and was an incredibly trusted aide, as was Jared. And it's in that capacity that they're being called into the grand jury. And I should say, it's not just about what happened on January 6th. There's a wealth of information they could have about the fake elector scheme, about the pressure on DOJ, obviously the pressure on Mike Pence. I mean, there's all sorts of aspects of the investigation. Indeed, it could even go into Mar-a-Lago because it could deal with what was it that they were told about how to retain or not retain documents. So there are lots of ways they could become very useful witnesses. I'd say the other thing to really pay attention to is something Harry had said, and I'd like to underscore, which is this isn't just asking for them to come in for an interview. This is asking for them to come in and be in the grand jury. And that is, to me, the fact that shows that Jack Smith is really being tenacious. That is, usually there are all sorts of accommodations that are made for people like this to be interviewed, to have their counsel present. But this is saying, no, like everyone in America, I'm entitled to everyone's testimony in the grand jury, and they're being treated just like everyone else. And I think that shows, it's no longer like in the Mueller special counsel investigation. The former president is now the former president. The attorney general is not Attorney General Barr. And those kinds of accommodations don't need to be made, or Jack Smith is going to be fired. And you see him really taking advantage of that and making sure he can get their testimony under oath in the grand jury, which is what you really need to do to set up a case going forward if you are going to bring charges.
5 seconds?
Oh, go ahead. Let me ask Andrew a follow-up question on that, though. I mean, Andrew, if Ivanka's testimony was used by the Congressional Committee as part of a piece with Bill Barr, did Trump know he lost? Yes. Did you tell him these claims were bogus? I told him they were bull bleep. Ivanka, did you see it that way? Are there any assumptions that could be made or any guesses as to whether or not Bill Barr has been asked to go before the grand jury or whether or not that's happened already?
I would suspect that if it hasn't happened, it's going to happen. Some of this will depend on just what Jack Smith's view is of how thorough the questioning was of Bill Barr by the January 6th committee. The more you think they did a thorough job and you don't have other questions, the less you might find the need to do that. But in general, I have to say, in my experience, there are always other questions and other things that you'd want to make sure you lock down because you're doing the investigation for a different purpose. You really are thinking, how will this play in a criminal trial? So I would have the assumption that if Bill Barr has not received a grand jury subpoena to testify, that he will.